Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. I've got another interesting one here for us to discuss today. Uh, in the last video, we spoke a bit about some of the more overt rhetoric that's sort of permeated all of media and entertainment. But I also noted in that video that there were a number of more nuanced and subtle messaging that is being shoehorned into the content that we're consuming that we don't often hear about, and or we've become programmed to the extent that it's not something we think to address. Well, one of those issues that I felt was the most prominent is the trope of the submissive man, right? Now this is something that I've noticed across all mediums, literature, film, TV, video games, and so on. But I am going to focus this video on particularly anime, right? And I'm choosing to focus on that in particular because obviously it's a growing form of entertainment, and I think this discussion is going to become more relevant in the future as there's a huge push to make anime even more commercialized and appealing to the Western demographic, right? So I want to sort of focus on that, but obviously, whatever all the issues that I'm discussing here apply in all mediums. Yes. Now, uh, obviously, this isn't something new. In the West, we've had similar discussions around the era of the bumbling idiot father in sitcoms and the strong, empowered, wife. But in anime, it is often a bit more subtle, and that is something that I think we've overlooked for far too long, and the sort of damage that that is actually doing. So we can look at some of the more popular anime that's in the public limelight, such as shonen like Naruto, for example. And if you watch that series, you'll know Sakura's behavior towards Naruto, right, where she's always punching, slapping, embarrassing, berating him in one way or another. We can go back a few years to Dragon Ball Z, where we'll see the same dynamic between Chi-Chi and Goku, right? Later on, they'll introduce Vegeta, who is sort of the man's man, and slowly, as the years went on, his relationship with Bulma started to reflect the very same one that exists with Chi-Chi and Goku, and it's that Bulma would scream and yell at him and throw things and berate him in the very same manner. And so you quickly wonder what happened to the Vegeta that we were introduced to, who was a bit prideful, right, as a man, as a Saiyan, and how he fell to the same position that Goku found himself in with this woman who is constantly yelling at him and frankly disrespecting him. Now we can go back even further. One of these series that became popular in the early 2000s was Full Metal Alchemist. And in that anime, it's the very same thing, the relationship between Winry and Ed. And it was often the depiction of her hitting him with her wrench, and again, berating him, shouting at him, and all of these things that um, has just become more and more prominent as the years went on. If you go even beyond that, a series that was popular in the 90s was Inuyasha. And I bring that one up in particular because I think it's quite poignant that they were not so subtle with it in that series. And Inuyasha was a demon, of course, and his co-star in that series was Kagome. And in that series, she had this spell that would effectively incapacitate Inuyasha whenever he was misbehaving, and it's literally a command that says "sit, boy," and that it would immediately incapacitate Inuyasha. And it's interesting that, as I said, they weren't as nuanced with it in that series, where she was effectively giving the man a command, treating him very much like a dog. So this is something that has been ongoing for decades and decades. Um, But as I said, frankly, no one really has spoken out about it. And part of that reason is that often when this discussion is had, the usual suspects, which are new anime fans, typically it's the new generation of anime fans who've been effectively programmed to believe that this is the norm, and their response is typically that it's for comedic effect. No, again, I brought up the example before with the sitcom era in the US, where that was also the intent and using comedic effect to communicate a lot of this rhetoric that they were trying to push in their comedy series. Now, if you look at the West and how that comedy has played out today in the male female dynamic in the US, it has all but contributed to a fracture in the relationship between men and women, because these are the people who were raised on those comedies, whether it was Cheers, Friends, Modern Family, and how those dynamics have played out. We have to ask the question: how has that impacted Western culture? Again, if you look at the US, the results are there, right? I won't get too much into the politics of it all, but you can see a clear divide, and people underestimate the impact of these stories that you consume on a daily basis. If you grew up watching a lot of this, then it would be unsurprising that you felt this is the dynamic that should exist between a man and a woman. Now, anime is a bit more sinister in that it targets a younger demographic, and again, in large part, these are the people who don't see an issue with it because they've been watching shonen, and this is something that has been very prevalent in shonen, and so this is what they've been raised to believe is the norm. But we do have to ask again, whether this is whether we're looking at the full picture here. We can dismiss the relationships in all the anime that I've mentioned before and as just comedic, but we can examine the relationships in Japan and how that has played out as a result, or at least if not fully, in part of the entertainment that they have consumed over a number of decades. They have bought into this narrative that this is a relationship that should exist between man and woman, where the man is treated as submissive and he should be submissive, and the woman should be berating him constantly, or slapping or hitting him, and it's supposed to be playful or affectionate. No, in my mind, it seems almost absurd to consider that this is a normal relationship dynamic. In the real world, how this plays out, it's typically quite the opposite. No man really wants to come home to a woman that is constantly berating him, insulting him, or hitting him in some way, because it shows a lack of respect. But again, we're the generation who has grown up on this content, grown up consuming this content, and so it's very easy for us to consider this to be the norm. In Japan's case, I like to look at Japan as sort of a study case that is 10 years ahead of the West in terms of what we should and should not do. And if we examine Japan as it is now, where they have an aging population, they have an equal amount of deaths as they do birth. If not, I believe the number of deaths actually exceed the number of births. And that is in part, yes, due to the breakdown in the male and female relationship. And the male and female relationship, of course, there are a number of factors. Economical factors will play a huge part in it. There's no denying that. But in terms of how women have grown to perceive the men in Japanese society, that is largely going to be influenced by what it is that they've been consuming. And these are the stories that that they have grown up with, where the male-female dynamic is such that a man is to be submissive. That is an unavoidable truth. Now, as we see things play out similarly in the West, while I was doing research for this video, I came across a film that is coming out. I believe it's coming out this month, called the Drama, with Zendaya and Robert Pattinson. And it just popped up, and I found it quite interesting that for the promotion for this film, that this is the image they actually chose to use. If you look at the image, you'll see Robert Pattinson, a broken and beaten, literally beaten. He has a black eye in the photo, a broken and beaten man, and standing next to him is Zendaya, looking well, wearing a jacket over her wedding gown, no doubt some sort of rebellion against the tradition. And that is what they've chosen to use to promote this relationship. I'm assuming they're a couple based on the summary of the film. And this is what has become normalized. The submissive man, the beaten, broken man standing next to a strong girl boss. Ah, now we can look at literature. I like, I tend to believe that history, what's the saying? History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And we can look at literature sort of as a case study. What once was the bastion for, storytelling and artistic expression has largely become inundated with the same rhetoric, where the stories or the publications are pushing this very same narrative, where the women are at the center of it all and the men are sort of in the back. Now, what has become of literature over the years? If you look at it now, it's a dying industry. And this is despite the growing number of female readers and female publishers. Yeah, I find that very interesting because um, despite the fact that they have largely replaced men in that industry, the literacy itself has gone down in the US. I believe it's down by 30%. The number of, I believe 50% of adults read below the sixth grade level. And that is what literacy has largely become. And that's partly because obviously technology again plays a part, but it is in large part due to the decline in the quantity of the stories that are being made. One of the reasons why Hollywood currently struggles as it does, they've taken to making a lot of remakes of classics, something that we've all noticed within the past several years. Um, and it's easy to just point and say this is just corporate greed, just trying to milk a franchise or an IP and get whatever it is they can from it. But we're also ignoring the other factor here, which is that there are no stories for them to pull from. Again, as I've just outlined, where literacy is concerned, the quantity of what's being published has significantly declined, and all Hollywood really has to pull from, from what women are publishing and what women are reading, it's largely softcore pornography. That is what largely dominates publishing at the moment. Now, Hollywood can do their best, I suppose, and take a risk at making one of those, and I'm sure they eventually will, in some attempt to appeal to the feminine audience. But there's nothing there for them to pull from that will have a wide appeal, that will be something that everyone, the family included, and men can enjoy. And so, because there's an absence of source material for them to use, The only alternative is to pull from the works that, have stood the test of time, which were largely written by men. And I don't just hold the women to blame for this. I think in large part this is a male controlled issue. As I've said before, often when this issue is or this rhetoric is challenged, the loudest detractors are the men who I don't know how else to define them. These are weak and pathetic men who have accepted that their role is to be a submissive man. And I remain unapologetic in calling them weak and pathetic because these are the men that contribute to the destruction of our stories. At the end of the day, one of the reasons why it's important to tackle this is that weak men who are not leaders or have given up their leadership roles, these men cannot write stories. And so this vacuum that you felt, where you're not getting any heroic, positive stories. You're not getting any of these stories coming out of Hollywood or anywhere for that matter in the West. One of the reasons you're not getting those stories because these men are not equipped to write those stories. And so we do have to sort of shame that lifestyle. We can't encourage men to continue to be this beaten down. They've essentially become the very characters that we were discussing in this video, the submissive man. And a submissive man cannot write good stories. And that is why we are at a point where there's this feeling of creative bankruptcy because there are no men to tell the stories. There are no men to tell the heroic journey. Now, I do have some hope that this can be addressed. I'm a hopeful guy. And one of the reasons why I say this is because we can trace this shift back to perhaps the maybe 30 or 20 or 30 years ago, right? With anime like Golgo 13, Wicked City, Fist of the North Star, Captain Harlock, and so on. Those anime that came out around the 70s and 80s, the male characters in them, these men were respected by the women in their company. There was no depiction of the men there being berated, insulted, or beaten by the women. And this sort of highlighted the Japanese intention to appeal to the Western audience because it was around this time in the US that the sitcom boom took over with this, the bumbling idiot father and the empowered wife. And so Japan felt the need to appeal to the Western sensibilities by adapting. And so in the early 90s and 2000s, there was this sudden shift of these weakened male characters who were submissive and were being berated by the strong woman and being hit and assaulted in certain ways, but for comedic effect, right? It's no coincidence that that comedic effect sort of aligned with Western sitcoms that hit the golden age during that very same era. So we we know what the issue is. We've seen the damage that it continues to do to all our stories, novels, film, TV, video games. We see where this is all heading because this has happened before. And it will continue to happen so long as we allow it to happen. We can no longer afford this position where we make excuses for this content to continue to be pushed. And I do have some hope because I believe even something like My Hero Academia that I do have criticisms of, but one of the things that I do believe it sort of does right is it doesn't have a lot of that. It has the one-off character, I forget his name, the one that pulls things from his hair. it has that one-off character who's constantly doing lecherous things, which is another trope that I may talk about some other time. But where he gets sort of berated and so on. But the protagonist in Deku doesn't necessarily fall prey to that same problem. Deku has other issues, unfortunately, where he's constantly weeping and crying, and he's not a very stoic character, which is another trope that is something that I'll probably make a separate video on. But there's some hope that the more modern or the newer anime that are coming out are starting to abandon that. Unfortunately, it's just in time for the Western companies to sort of demand more access to anime. We see it happen with Netflix, and they're investing heavily in that. And they will want the anime. They will want anime to sort of adapt Western values in how they depict men and women. So while I have hope that there is some change, that will largely depend on the manga artists in Japan on their ability to say no, and even if that means turning down a check. Unfortunately, I'm not sure how realistic that is, but um, we have to make sacrifices to protect the art, and I would make that same recommendation to the audience as well, and suggest that they should reject the anime that begin to depict men in this manner, right? Anything that is released that is depicting the male character who is supposed to be the hero, who is supposed to be stoic, who's supposed to be brave, but this narrative that he should be submissive to a female character, that is something that we have to reject. We're constantly talking about what is missing from entertainment and how the quality of entertainment has declined. But we are not holding ourselves responsible for encouraging the very same narratives that are being pushed. Whenever there's an announcement, there's ever so often there are excuses being made to say, it's not a big deal. You know, it's just this one time. But whenever that conversation comes up, I do have to ask if it is not such a big deal, right? The this portrayal of the male characters being submissive and berated by women. If it is not a big deal and if it is just for comedic effect, why is it that we don't see it in reverse? There are no instances in shonen anime that have been released where the male character is berating the woman, hitting her with a tool or slapping her or anything of that effect. It seems to only be relevant or necessary when it impacts the male character. So I reject that notion that this is that it's just for comedic effect or it's not a big deal. If it wasn't a big deal, then this is something that we should be seeing. That we should see a dynamic where the both men and women are participating in that, and that's just not happening. If we know and acknowledge that, the only question now remains and this is to the men and boys watching the anime. Do you, as a man, as a boy, do you take pride in yourself? And that is a question that needs to be answered because if you are someone who has pride and self-respect, then you would not continue to support and watch content that either depicts the men as submissive, or if it is that you have children, particularly young boys, I cannot imagine you would want to subject them to content where the men and boys that they would look up to are shown to be weak and submissive men rather than strong, competent leaders. So there's not much there's really not much we can do about about the anime that have come and gone, but I do think we should be demanding more if it is that we want to see improvements in storytelling, not just in anime, but across the board. The missing ingredient is just that. It is we need stories that show men being competent. We need stories that show men being respected, and these are typically universal in what they sort of demonstrate, because one of the films that's come currently in theaters now, Project Hail Mary. I haven't seen it as yet, but I am hearing good things about it. Um, but between that, we had F1 a year ago, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. All these stories that seem to resonate more often than not with the public generally have the what we've just discussed, which is competent men being good at something, illustrating virtues that we want to highlight in society, and things that appeal both to men and women. Because, as I've said many, many times on the channel here, one of the reasons so many of these stories that attempt to deconstruct the masculine, one of the reasons they fail, whether it's Ballerina, Furiosa, the recent The Bride, one of the reasons they fail to appeal to the audience is, in order to make a character compelling, it is largely impossible, particularly if you're in a genre film, it's largely impossible to do that without masculine characteristics. And at the end of the day, men have very little interest in seeing women act like men. And then the female audience has very little interest in seeing women act like men. And so those tend to fail to have a wide appeal. But the ones that do get this right, the ones that do demonstrate the male competence and bravery and stoicism, those tend to do fairly well. And we're seeing that happen with Project Hail Mary as well. So if we want to see change, unfortunately or fortunately, we do need to recognize that we have a responsibility in making that change happen. And that does include rejecting these stories, particularly those that tend to depict men as weak, men as submissive, and not taking up their rightful role as leaders. So I'll leave it there with you guys for today. Um, I'm not sure whether this is going to become a series of videos, because there are a number of tropes that we do need to address. So this may be the first of many, but I'll give it some thought, and depending on how well this video does, we may continue to do others as well. All right, thanks very much for coming by, guys, and I will see you for the next one.